You've probably heard of Stonehenge, the pyramids, Machu Picchu, monuments that pull millions of tourists every year, their mysteries splashed across documentaries and textbooks. But what if I told you that in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, there exists a network of roads so geometrically precise, so astronomically aligned, and so utterly enigmatic that even after a century of excavation, we still can't agree on why they were built? Welcome to Chaco Canyon, where between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, the ancestral Puebloan people engineered a civilization that defies every easy explanation. We're talking about roads that run perfectly straight for 30 miles or more, cutting through mesas and arroyos without deviation. We're talking about massive great houses, some containing more than 600 rooms, constructed with timber hauled from forests 70 miles away. We're talking about alignments to solar and lunar events so accurate that modern surveyors shake their heads in disbelief. And yet, for all the data, for all the pottery shards and dendrochronology and ground-penetrating radar, the purpose of Chaco Canyon remains one of archaeology's most stubbornly guarded secrets. Was it a ceremonial center where pilgrims gathered for solstice rituals? A trading hub that connected cultures from the Pacific to the Great Plains? An astronomical observatory run by a priestly elite? Or something stranger still, a place of power where giants once walked, where the boundary between earth and sky grew thin, where knowledge was inscribed not just in stone but in the very geometry of the landscape. In the next hour, we're going to walk those ancient roads together, you and I. We're going to stand in the shadow of Pueblo Bonito at dawn and try to imagine what it felt like when drums echoed across the canyon floor. We're going to follow the Great North Road into emptiness and ask why anyone would engineer a highway to nowhere. We're going to sift through the evidence and the legends, and by the end, you'll understand why Chaco Canyon isn't just an unsolved mystery. It's a mirror that reflects back our deepest questions about human ambition, spirituality, and the things we build when we believe we're touching eternity. Let's begin at the center of it all, with a structure so massive and so carefully planned that when you stand inside its crumbling walls, you can almost hear the ghosts of 1,000 voices raised in song. Pueblo Bonito, the name means beautiful town, in Spanish, is the crown jewel of Chaco Canyon, a D-shaped great house that rises 4 stories in places and sprawls across nearly 2 acres of canyon floor. Construction began around 850 CE and continued in distinct phases for more than 2 centuries, each generation adding new rooms, new kivas, those circular ceremonial chambers sunk into the earth, and new layers of mystery. At its peak, Pueblo Bonito contained approximately 650 rooms and 40 kivas, yet here's the puzzle that keeps archaeologists awake at night. Despite all that space, despite all that monumental effort, the evidence suggests that no more than 100 people ever lived there at any given time. Think about that for a moment. 650 rooms for 100 residents. That's not a town. That's not even a village. So what was it? Some researchers argue that Pueblo Bonito was a ceremonial center, a place where people gathered periodically for rituals tied to the agricultural calendar, planting, harvest, solstice observations. The abundance of kivas supports this idea. They're ritual spaces, not living quarters, and their sheer number suggests that Chaco was a destination, a pilgrimage site where different communities came together to reinforce social bonds and spiritual beliefs. Others point to the vast quantities of turquoise found in the rooms, more than 50,000 pieces in some excavations, along with copper bells from Mesoamerica, macaw feathers from tropical forests, and seashells from both the Pacific and the Gulf of California. That kind of exotic wealth suggests Pueblo Bonito was a trading nexus, a hub where goods and ideas flowed from 1,000 miles in every direction. But here's where it gets stranger. The architecture of Pueblo Bonito isn't random. The building is aligned with cardinal directions and specific solar events. The main axis runs perfectly east-west, and certain rooms and windows framed the sunrise on the summer solstice with breathtaking precision. Room 28, located in the oldest section of the structure, was a high-status burial chamber that contained 2 men interred with staggering wealth, thousands of turquoise beads, ceremonial staffs, carved wooden objects, and burial goods that speak of power, prestige, and possibly religious authority. Were these men kings? Priests? Astronomer-shamans who read the sky and told the people when to plant, when to harvest, when to gather for ceremonies that kept the cosmos in balance? We still don't know. And then there are the legends whispered by some of the Puebloan descendants, stories that speak of giants who once walked Chaco, beings of immense stature who laid the first stones and taught the people the mysteries of the sky. Dismiss it as myth if you like, but remember, every culture that builds on this scale does so because they believe they're constructing something eternal, something that bridges the human and the divine. Picture yourself standing in the central plaza of Pueblo Bonito on a midwinter morning, the air so cold it burns your lungs, the canyon walls glowing amber in the low sun. All around you, the walls rise, sandstone blocks fitted with such care that in places you can't slip a knife blade between them. The silence is absolute, broken only by the cry of a raven overhead. You close your eyes and try to imagine the scene 12 centuries ago, the plaza filled with hundreds of people, smoke rising from cooking fires, the rhythmic pounding of drums, voices lifted in songs whose words are lost but whose melodies might still linger in the wind. What were they asking for? Rain, certainly. This is desert country, and survival depends on the summer monsoons. Good harvests, healthy children, protection from enemies. But maybe they were asking for something deeper too. Maybe they were trying to align themselves with forces they believed governed not just the weather but the movement of the stars, the turning of the seasons, the very fabric of existence. That's the thing about monumental architecture. It's never just about utility. It's about reaching towards something greater than yourself, about making a mark that says, "We were here. We mattered. We understood." Now let's talk about something that sounds impossible until you see it with your own eyes. The roads of Chaco Canyon, a network of engineered pathways that radiate out from the great houses like spokes on a wheel, some extending for more than 60 miles across terrain that would make a modern civil engineer weep. These aren't trails. They're roads. Wide, flat, deliberately constructed avenues that average about 30 feet across and were built by removing soil and vegetation down to bedrock, then filling and leveling with compacted clay and stone. In places where the roads encounter cliffs or steep descents, the builders carved stairways directly into the rock face. Where they cross arroyos, those dry gullies that flash with water during storms, they built ramps on both sides so the roadbed could continue in a straight line. And that's the truly uncanny part. These roads are straight. Not sort of straight. Not roughly straight. Geometrically, obsessively, impossibly straight. The Great North Road, for instance, runs almost perfectly due north from Pueblo Alto, another great house perched on the mesa top above Pueblo Bonito, for more than 30 miles, terminating at a small structure called Chaco Canyon that appears to have no particular strategic or economic value. It doesn't connect to a water source. It doesn't lead to a village or a quarry or a trade center. It just ends in empty desert. Why would anyone invest the staggering labor required to build a 30-mile highway to nowhere? One hypothesis, championed by several archaeologists over the decades, is that the roads weren't meant for trade or transportation in any practical sense. They were ceremonial pathways, pilgrimage routes that people walked during sacred times of the year, solstices, equinoxes, perhaps lunar events, to gather at Chaco for rituals that reinforced a shared cosmology across the entire Chacoan regional system, which at its height included more than 70 outlying great houses scattered across the San Juan Basin. The straightness of the roads, in this interpretation, is symbolic, a metaphor for spiritual purity, for the direct connection between the human realm and the realm of the gods. Walk the straight path, stay aligned with the cosmic order, and the rains will come, the crops will grow, the world will continue. But other researchers aren't convinced. They point out that while the roads are undeniably impressive, the amount of actual foot traffic they show is surprisingly light. There's relatively little wear on the road surfaces, relatively few artifacts dropped along the routes. If thousands of pilgrims were trekking these roads twice a year, we'd expect more evidence of their passage. So maybe the roads served a different function. Maybe they were sight lines, visual markers that allowed observers at different great houses to communicate over vast distances using smoke signals or reflected light. Or maybe they were alignments to celestial events, with the roads themselves forming a kind of terrestrial map that mirrored the positions of stars or planets, or the path of the sun across the sky during different seasons. Some researchers have noted that certain Chacoan roads point toward distant landmarks, mesas, peaks, distinctive rock formations, that may have held sacred significance. In this view, the roads are less about getting from point A to point B and more about creating a sacred geography, a landscape inscribed with meaning that only the initiated could fully read. And then there's the wildcard theory, the one that makes conventional archaeologists uncomfortable but refuses to go away entirely. The idea that the roads were built to accommodate something, or someone, of unusual size. Stories persist among some Puebloan oral traditions of a race of giants, beings who could carry burdens no ordinary human could manage, who needed wide roads and grand architecture to suit their stature. Bones have been reported, though rarely confirmed by modern scientific standards, of individuals far exceeding normal human height, buried in remote alcoves along the roadways. Legends speak of the Old Ones, the first inhabitants of Chaco, who possessed knowledge of the stars and the earth that was later lost when they departed or perished in some cataclysm whose details have faded into myth. Again, you can dismiss this as folklore, as the kind of storytelling that happens when people try to explain ruins whose origins they no longer remember. But consider this: every enduring mystery leaves space for wonder, and wonder is the soil in which both science and myth take root. Picture yourself walking the Great North Road at dawn, the sun just cresting the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert scrub. The road stretches ahead of you, impossibly straight, vanishing into heat, shimmer, and distance. Your boots crunch on the ancient surface, and you realize that every step you take is a step someone took 1,000 years ago, walking the same path for reasons we can still only guess. What were they thinking? What did they see? What stories did they tell each other as they walked mile after mile under a sky so vast it seems to curve down to meet the earth at the edges of vision? Let's shift now to another enigma within the Chaco system, one that takes us high above the canyon floor to the windswept mesa tops where the ancestral Puebloans built structures that challenge every assumption about their priorities and capabilities. Pueblo Alto sits on the northern rim of Chaco Canyon, a great house that's smaller than Pueblo Bonito but positioned with such strategic brilliance that from its walls, you can see virtually the entire canyon system spread out below you. Construction here began around 1020 CE, and the site consists of roughly 95 rooms, 21 kivas, and a massive trash mound that has proven to be one of the richest sources of artifacts in the entire Chaco region. But here's what doesn't make sense. Hauling water up to the mesa top would have been a brutal daily chore in this desert climate, and there's no natural water source nearby. Hauling building materials up the cliffs would have been equally grueling. So why not build in the canyon where water and resources are more accessible? The answer, many researchers believe, lies in what Pueblo Alto could see. From this vantage point, observers had a line of sight to numerous other great houses in the region, both within Chaco Canyon and at outlying sites up to 50 miles away. If the roads were indeed sight lines, if communication across the Chacoan world depended on visual signals, then Pueblo Alto was the perfect relay station, a hub that could receive messages from distant communities and pass them on to Pueblo Bonito below. Some archaeologists have gone further, suggesting that Pueblo Alto was an observatory, a place where astronomer-priests tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and possibly planets to determine the timing of agricultural activities and ceremonial events. The site's position offers unobstructed views of the horizon in all directions, making it ideal for observing celestial events. And when you combine that with the precision of the road alignments and the solar orientations built into the great houses, you start to see Chaco not as a series of separate buildings but as a single integrated system, a landscape-scale instrument designed to measure time, mark sacred moments, and keep human activity synchronized with the rhythms of the cosmos. Yet for all that theoretical elegance, the physical evidence remains frustratingly ambiguous. The trash mound at Pueblo Alto is stuffed with pottery sherds, animal bones, and the remains of what appear to be massive feasts: deer, rabbits, and an astonishing quantity of pronghorn antelope, many of which would have been hunted dozens of miles away and hauled to the site. Were these feasts part of regular ceremonies, seasonal gatherings where different communities came together to eat, dance, and renew their social bonds? Or were they displays of power, events where elites demonstrated their ability to mobilize labor and resources on a grand scale? The sheer volume of bones and broken pottery suggests that whatever happened at Pueblo Alto, it happened repeatedly and involved large numbers of people. Some researchers estimate that individual feasting events might have drawn several hundred participants, which raises yet another question: where did they all sleep? If Pueblo Alto has fewer than 100 rooms and most of them show little evidence of regular habitation, then the visitors must have camped outside, perhaps in temporary structures that left no archaeological trace, or perhaps they returned to their home communities after the ceremonies concluded. It's also possible that many participants never entered the Great House at all, that Pueblo Alto was reserved for an elite class: priests, clan leaders, traders, while ordinary folk gathered in the canyon below or at designated ceremonial areas that we haven't yet identified. And here's where the mystery deepens. Among the artifacts found at Pueblo Alto are objects that speak of connections spanning the entire Southwest and beyond: shell bracelets from the Gulf of California, turquoise from mines in modern-day Nevada and New Mexico, copper bells that could only have come from northern Mexico, and pottery styles from the Hohokam culture far to the south and the ancestral Puebloan groups to the north and east. Chaco wasn't isolated. It was plugged into a vast network of exchange, and Pueblo Alto, perched on its mesa top like a sentinel, may have been one of the nerve centers where that network was managed and maintained. But there's a darker thread woven through some of the oral traditions surrounding the mesa top sites. Stories speak of forbidden places, of structures where only the initiated could tread, where ancient rites were performed under the light of the full moon or at the moment of solar eclipse. There are whispers of sacrifices, not human, most accounts insist, but offerings of precious goods, turquoise thrown into ritual pits, pottery deliberately smashed, animals killed and left to the ravens as gifts to the sky. And there are tales, perhaps apocryphal, of individuals who ventured too close to these sacred spaces and were struck by misfortune, illness, madness, accidents that seemed to come from nowhere. Whether you interpret these stories as literal warnings or as metaphors for the social boundaries that separated the sacred elite from the common people, they remind us that Chaco wasn't just a feat of engineering. It was a place charged with meaning, a landscape where the visible and invisible worlds were believed to intersect. Picture yourself on the mesa top at Pueblo Alto as the sun sets, the canyon filling with shadow, the wind carrying the scent of sage and dust. You're standing on ground that was considered holy, powerful, perhaps dangerous by the people who built it. The horizon glows red and purple, and for a moment, you understand viscerally what it might have meant to live in a world where every rock, every road, every angle of sunlight was part of a grand design, a cosmic map that you were privileged, or burdened, to read. Now we need to talk about the timber, because it's one of those details that sounds trivial until you grasp the sheer scale of the operation, and then it becomes one of the most perplexing aspects of the entire Chaco phenomenon. The great houses of Chaco Canyon contain an estimated 200,000 trees, ponderosa pine and fir, mostly, used as roof beams, wall supports, and structural members. These aren't saplings. These are mature trees, often more than 16 feet long and a foot thick, harvested from forests in the Chusca and San Mateo Mountains, which lie between 40 and 70 miles from Chaco Canyon. Let that sink in. 70 miles? Across desert terrain with no rivers to float the logs, no pack animals stronger than dogs. This is pre-horse, pre-burro North America, and no wheels. Every single one of those 200,000 trees was cut down with stone tools, trimmed, and then carried, almost certainly on human shoulders, across mesas, through arroyos, over ridges, mile after backbreaking mile, to be incorporated into structures whose purpose we're still debating. The labor investment is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest it would have taken something like 5 million person-hours just to procure and transport the timber, not counting the additional labor to quarry and haul the sandstone blocks, to mix and apply the mud mortar, to plaster the walls, to dig the kivas, to build the roads. We're talking about a civilization that, at its peak, probably numbered only a few thousand people in the immediate Chaco Canyon area, yet they managed to mobilize labor on a scale that rivals contemporary societies with 10 or 20 times the population. How? One possibility is that Chaco operated as a theocratic center with a powerful priestly class that could compel or inspire labor contributions from a much larger regional population. If people believe that the rituals performed at Chaco were essential to the survival of everyone, that failing to contribute to the great houses would result in drought, famine, or cosmic catastrophe, then perhaps they willingly devoted months or years of their lives to hauling timber and stone. This model has parallels in other ancient societies, from the pyramid builders of Egypt to the cathedral builders of medieval Europe. Faith can move mountains, or at least an astonishing number of logs. Another theory focuses on reciprocal exchange. Maybe communities contributed labor to Chaco Canyon in exchange for access to resources, turquoise, exotic goods, ceremonial knowledge, that only the Chacoan elites could provide. In this model, Chaco functioned as a kind of sacred marketplace, a place where spiritual and material economies intersected. You bring timber and labor, you participate in the rituals, and in return, you receive goods and blessings that elevate your status back home. It's a system that benefits everyone, at least in theory, and it might explain why the Chacoan regional system remained cohesive for more than 2 centuries. But some researchers aren't satisfied with these explanations. They point out that in the final decades of Chacoan dominance, roughly between 1100 and 1140 CE, construction activity became almost frenzied. New great houses were started, existing ones were expanded, and timber was imported at an unprecedented rate, even as environmental evidence suggests the region was slipping into drought. It's as if the society was doubling down, building bigger and faster in the face of mounting ecological stress. Why? Was it desperation, a last-ditch effort to appease the gods and bring back the rains? Was it political competition, with rival factions trying to outdo each other in demonstrations of piety and power? Or was it something else, a crisis of faith or authority that drove the leadership to prove their legitimacy through ever more monumental construction? And then there's the unsettling detail that some of the later timber shows evidence of being salvaged from earlier structures. Roof beams were pulled out of older rooms and reused in newer ones, sometimes with the original plaster still clinging to them. That's not normal. That suggests a society under strain, a system that's starting to crack. The forests are farther away, the labor pool is thinning, the resources aren't flowing in like they used to. But the building must continue, because the building is the point, the building is the ritual, the building is the only thing holding the cosmos together. Or so they may have believed. And then, around 1150 CE, it stopped. Construction at Chaco Canyon ceased almost abruptly. The great houses were abandoned, the roads fell silent, and the people dispersed to other regions, founding new communities or joining existing ones. The reasons are still debated: drought, social collapse, warfare, environmental degradation from centuries of resource extraction, but the end was swift. Within a generation or two, Chaco Canyon was a ghost town, its monumental structures already beginning their slow surrender to wind and rain. Yet here's the haunting part: the descendants of the Chacoan people didn't forget. Pueblo and oral traditions speak of Chaco as a place of great power and great danger, a place where the ancestors achieved wonders but also made mistakes. Some traditions warn against returning to Chaco, against disturbing the ruins, against awakening whatever forces were set in motion there and never properly put to rest. Modern Puebloan consultants who work with archaeologists often express deep ambivalence about excavating Chaco, a sense that some knowledge is meant to remain buried, some stories are better left untold. Picture yourself in the cool shade of a half-collapsed room in one of the great houses, running your hand over a roof beam that someone carried 70 miles on their shoulders 1,000 years ago. The wood is still solid, still bearing weight, still doing the job it was shaped to do. You can see the axe marks, the places where stone blades bit into living wood, and you try to imagine the labor, the sweat, the blisters, the camaraderie or resentment or grim determination that drove people to do this work. What did they believe they were building? And when it all came crashing down, when the rain stopped and the people left and the silence settled over the canyon like dust, did anyone look back and wonder if it had all been worth it? Let's turn our attention now to something even stranger, a phenomenon that exists at the intersection of astronomy, architecture, and what might be the earliest form of graphic communication in the American Southwest: the rock art of Chaco Canyon, and in particular, a single petroglyph that has sparked decades of debate and wild speculation. High on the cliffs of Fajada Butte, a steep-sided mesa that rises from the canyon floor like a sentinel, there's a spiral carved into the rock face. It's about a foot across, deeply incised, and positioned behind 3 large stone slabs that lean against the cliff, creating a narrow gap. And here's where it gets eerie. At specific times of the year, the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and the spring and fall equinoxes, a dagger of light cuts through the gap between the stone slabs and bisects or frames the spiral in precise, repeating patterns. At summer solstice, a single blade of light pierces the exact center of the spiral. At winter solstice, 2 blades bracket the spiral on either side. At the equinoxes, a smaller dagger touches the edge. It's called the Sun Dagger, and when it was first documented in detail by artist Anna Sofar in 1977, it sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Here was proof, undeniable, photographically documented proof, that the Ancestral Puebloans were not only observing the sun's annual cycle with incredible precision but were creating monumental art to mark those observations. The implications are staggering. If the Sun Dagger is intentional, and most researchers believe it is, then the people who carved that spiral and positioned those stone slabs understood the mechanics of solar movement well enough to predict, years or decades in advance, exactly where the shadows would fall on specific days. That's not casual observation. That's systematic astronomy, the kind of knowledge that requires generations of careful sky watching, record keeping, and mathematical sophistication. But how did they do it? They had no written language, at least not in the way we usually think of writing. They had no instruments, no telescopes, no astrolabes. What they had was patience, acute attention to the natural world, and a cultural imperative that made the tracking of time not just useful but sacred. The Sun Dagger wasn't alone. Researchers have identified numerous other potential solar and lunar markers at Chaco Canyon, alignments built into the walls of the great houses, petroglyphs positioned to catch specific angles of light, cairns and shrines on mesa tops that frame the rising or setting sun at solstices. Some researchers believe that Chaco was, in essence, a giant calendar made of stone, a landscape-scale device for tracking the passage of time and determining the optimal moments for planting, harvesting, and performing the rituals that, in the minds of the Chacoans, kept the universe running smoothly. Yet, for all the elegance of this interpretation, not everyone is convinced. Skeptics point out that the Sun Dagger site has been altered. One of the stone slabs shifted position in the late 20th century, possibly due to erosion or vandalism, which means we can't be entirely certain the alignments we see today are identical to what the Chacoans would have seen. Other researchers question whether the alignments are truly intentional or whether they're the result of chance, of humans imposing patterns on natural phenomena because that's what our brains are wired to do. After all, if you have hundreds of petroglyphs and thousands of architectural features scattered across a landscape, some of them are bound to align with celestial events just by random distribution. That's the statistician's argument, and it's worth considering. But then you stand at Fajada Butte on the summer solstice, and you watch that knife edge of light slide across the rock face and pierce the spiral's heart with such exquisite precision that it feels like the canyon is holding its breath. And in that moment, statistics seem beside the point. The people who built Chaco weren't thinking about random distributions and null hypotheses. They were thinking about the sun as a living force, a god or a spirit whose movements governed life and death, abundance and scarcity. They were trying to understand, to predict, to synchronize their lives with powers far greater than themselves. And whether or not every single alignment was intentionally engineered, the overall pattern is clear. Chaco Canyon was designed as a sacred landscape, a place where the boundaries between earth and sky, human and divine, became permeable. There's also a more speculative layer to the Sun Dagger story, one that touches on the enduring fascination with lost knowledge and ancient wisdom. Some researchers and enthusiasts have suggested that the astronomical alignments at Chaco reveal a level of sophistication that shouldn't have been possible for a so-called prehistoric culture, and therefore must have been influenced by contact with more advanced civilizations, Mesoamericans, perhaps, or even more exotic sources. This kind of thinking veers dangerously close to the discredited notion that indigenous peoples couldn't have achieved greatness on their own, that every impressive monument must be the work of mysterious outsiders or lost Atlantean super-scientists. Let's be clear, there's zero credible evidence that Chaco was built by anyone other than the Ancestral Puebloans, and there's no need to invoke vanished super-civilizations to explain their achievements. What we're seeing at Chaco is the result of human ingenuity, careful observation, and a cultural commitment to creating meaning in the landscape. That's not diminishing the mystery. That's honoring it. Because the real wonder isn't that some mythical lost race left behind secret knowledge. The real wonder is that ordinary humans, people with the same brains, the same capacity for curiosity and creativity that we have, looked up at the sky, watched the sun trace its arc, and figured out how to capture that movement in stone. They didn't have our technology, but they had time, attention, and a cultural framework that made such work meaningful. And that, in its way, is more astonishing than any tale of vanished civilizations. Picture yourself on Fujata Butte at dawn, the air still cool, the canyon below just beginning to glow with the first light. You're standing near the spiral, waiting for the sun to crest the horizon, waiting for the dagger of light to appear. And when it does, when that blade of brilliance slices through the gap and touches the stone, you feel it, a shiver that runs up your spine, a sense of connection to everyone who has stood here before you, waiting for the same moment, marking the same passage of time. We're still doing it, you realize. We're still watching the sky, still trying to find our place in the cosmic order. We just use different tools. There's one more piece of the Chaco puzzle we need to examine, and it's one of the most troubling: the evidence of violence and its possible role in the system's collapse. For decades, the prevailing narrative about Chaco Canyon emphasized cooperation, shared ritual, and peaceful exchange. The great houses were ceremonial centers where different communities came together in harmony. The roads were pilgrimage routes. The feasts were celebrations of unity. It was, in many retellings, an almost utopian vision of ancient indigenous life, a society that achieved monumental things through consensus and collective effort. But archaeology has a way of complicating comfortable stories, and in recent years, researchers have been forced to confront evidence that suggests the reality of Chaco was considerably darker. At several sites in the Chaco region, archaeologists have found human remains that show signs of violent death, trauma to the skull, dismemberment, and in some cases, evidence consistent with cannibalism. The most famous example comes from a site called Cowboy Wash, located outside the core Chaco area but linked to the Chacoan system by architecture and pottery styles. There, in a pit house dating to around 1150 CE, researchers found the bones of 7 individuals, men, women, and children, who had been killed, butchered, and cooked. Cut marks on the bones match patterns seen in animal butchery. Fragments of human muscle protein were recovered from cooking pots. The evidence is horrifying and undeniable. But what does it mean? Some researchers argue that the violence reflects the breakdown of the Chacoan system, a period of social chaos and desperation as environmental degradation, drought, and failed crops push communities to the brink. In this scenario, cannibalism might have been an extreme survival strategy, or it might have been ritualistic warfare, a way for competing groups to terrorize and demoralize their enemies. Other researchers suggest that violence might have been woven into the Chacoan system from the beginning, that the monumental architecture and the centralized control it implies could only have been maintained through coercion. Maybe the elites of Chaco ruled not just through spiritual authority but through the threat of force. Maybe the labor that built the great houses wasn't always voluntary. Maybe the outlying communities weren't partners but subjects, required to send tribute and workers to Chaco under threat of violent reprisal. There's also a possibility, uncomfortable as it is, that some of the violence was ritual in nature, not driven by hunger or political control but by religious beliefs that required human sacrifice or the ritual consumption of enemies. Practices that we find abhorrent today were, in various forms, part of many ancient cultures' spiritual lives. The Aztecs, the Inca, and numerous other Mesoamerican societies practiced human sacrifice as a core element of their cosmology. Is it possible that some form of ritual violence was also part of Chacoan religion? The evidence is ambiguous, and many researchers are deeply cautious about drawing conclusions, especially given the long history of racist caricatures that depicted Native Americans as inherently savage. But the bones are there, and they demand an explanation. And then there's the question of what happened to the people of Chaco when the system finally collapsed. The traditional story is that they migrated away, dispersing to found or join communities in the Rio Grande Valley, the Little Colorado River area, and other parts of the Southwest. Modern Puebloan peoples trace their ancestry, at least in part, to Chaco, and many oral traditions speak of migrations from the north or west, journeys that match the timeline of Chaco's abandonment. But some of those same traditions also speak of conflict, of groups that were driven out or fled in fear, of violence that accompanied the breaking of the old order. One oral account, recorded in the early 20th century and preserved in ethnographic records, tells of a powerful priesthood at Chaco that grew corrupt and tyrannical, demanding more and more from the people until finally the commoners rose up, burned the great houses, and scattered the elites. Whether this is literal history or symbolic narrative, a way of explaining and justifying the abandonment through a moral framework, is impossible to say. But it's a reminder that the descendants of Chaco have their own interpretations of what happened there, and those interpretations don't always align with the romanticized visions that outsiders sometimes project onto the ruins. There's also a persistent, though poorly documented, tradition that speaks of a curse on Chaco, a belief that disturbing the ruins or taking artifacts from the site will bring misfortune. Some early archaeologists reported strange accidents, illnesses, and financial disasters that they attributed, half seriously, half in jest, to the Chaco curse. Rangers and researchers who work at the site sometimes speak of an uneasy feeling, a sense of being watched or unwelcome, especially in certain areas of the canyon. Skeptics dismiss this as superstition, as the human tendency to find patterns in random misfortune. But it's worth noting that many indigenous cultures have specific prohibitions about disturbing burial sites and ancient ruins, rooted in a worldview that sees such places as inhabited by the spirits of the dead or by forces that should not be casually invoked. Whether or not you believe in curses, the existence of these traditions tells us something important. Chaco Canyon is not just an archaeological site. It's a place that still carries meaning, still evokes powerful emotions, still exists in the imaginations and spiritual lives of living communities. And that means our attempts to understand it are never just academic exercises. They're acts of engagement with a history that, for some people, is deeply personal and still unfolding. Picture yourself walking through Chaco Canyon at dusk, the shadows long and the air cooling, and you come across a scatter of pottery sherds half buried in the sand. You kneel to examine them, painted designs, geometric patterns, the work of someone's hands 1,000 years ago. And you wonder, who broke this pot? Was it an accident, a moment of clumsiness in the midst of daily life? Or was it deliberate, part of a ritual, an offering or a symbolic destruction? And if you pick up that sherd, if you slip it into your pocket as a souvenir, are you just collecting a piece of the past? Or are you disrupting something that should be left undisturbed? There's no easy answer, and the mystery of Chaco won't let you off the hook. It asks you to think about what you believe, about what you owe to the past, about the difference between understanding and appropriation. And in the end, maybe that's the most important mystery of all. Let's move now to one of the least understood and most visually striking aspects of the Chacoan landscape, the Great Kivas, those massive circular ceremonial structures that represent some of the most ambitious underground architecture in the ancient world. While smaller kivas, typically 15 to 20 feet in diameter, are found throughout the Chacoan great houses, the great kivas are in a category of their own, often exceeding 60 feet across and requiring engineering techniques that still impress modern architects. Casa Rinconada, built around 1100 CE on the south side of Chaco Canyon, is perhaps the finest example. This great kiva measures just over 63 feet in diameter and is perfectly circular, sunk into the earth to a depth of about 12 feet. The walls are made of precisely shaped sandstone blocks, and the roof, long since collapsed, was originally supported by 4 massive wooden pillars set into stone-lined pits arranged in a square at the center of the chamber. The entire structure could have accommodated several hundred people, and its design suggests it was meant to be a sensory experience unlike any other in the Chacoan world. Imagine descending into Casa Rinconada during a ceremony. You enter through a passageway on the north side, moving from blazing desert sunlight into cool, dim shadow. As your eyes adjust, you see the circular wall rising around you, the floor beaten smooth by countless feet, the 4 great pillars soaring up to support a roof that encloses you in sacred space. There are niches built into the walls at regular intervals, perhaps for offerings or for lamps that would cast flickering light across the chamber. There's a fire pit at the center, and you can imagine the smoke rising, the heat intensifying, the voices of hundreds of people raised in song or prayer, the sound amplified and resonant in the enclosed space. This isn't just a room. It's an instrument, a chamber designed to heighten every sense, to make you feel small and connected and part of something vast. But here's the puzzle. Casa Rinconada is aligned with cardinal directions and solar events with the same obsessive precision as the great houses. The entrance passage points almost exactly north. On the morning of the summer solstice, a shaft of sunlight enters through a small window on the northeast wall and illuminates a specific niche on the opposite wall. The alignment is too precise to be accidental, which means the builders understood not just how to construct a massive circular chamber underground but also how to orient it to capture specific moments of solar movement. Why? What was the significance of having the sun enter the kiva at solstice? Some researchers believe it was a form of ritual validation, a demonstration that the priests or leaders who controlled the ceremonies were truly connected to the cosmic forces they claimed to serve. If you can predict the exact moment when the sun will touch a particular spot on the kiva wall, if you can perform a ritual that coincides with that moment, then you're not just claiming to have power, you're proving it. You're showing everyone present that you understand the mechanics of the universe, that you can read the sky and align human activity with divine will. That's extraordinarily persuasive, especially in a culture where survival depends on correct timing. Planting too early or too late can mean the difference between feast and famine. But there's another layer to the mystery. Casa Rinconada stands alone, separated from the nearest great house by several hundred yards. It wasn't integrated into a residential or administrative structure. It was its own thing, a standalone ceremonial center. Why build it that way? Some archaeologists suggest that Casa Rinconada was intentionally kept separate as a neutral ground, a place where different factions or communities within the Chacoan system could gather without any single group dominating. If the great houses were associated with specific kin groups or religious societies, then Casa Rinconada might have been the one place where everyone was equal, where shared rituals could reinforce the bonds that held the larger system together. Others propose that the great kivas were used for initiation ceremonies, rites of passage where young people were inducted into secret societies or taught the esoteric knowledge that maintained Chacoan power. The enclosed, underground nature of the space would have been perfect for creating a sense of mystery and transformation. You enter as one thing, you participate in rituals that are hidden from the outside world, and you emerge as something new, a full member of the society, a bearer of sacred knowledge. And then there are the darker possibilities. Some oral traditions speak of the great kivas as places of judgment, where criminals or social transgressors were tried and punished, where oaths were sworn and curses pronounced. The enclosed space, the limited exits, the ability to control who enters and leaves, All of these features could serve not just religious functions but social control. If you're brought into the Great Kiva to face the assembled leaders of the community, with the walls looming around you and no easy escape, the psychological pressure would be immense. You'd confess, comply, accept punishment, do whatever was demanded to be allowed back into the light. Again, there's no definitive evidence for any single interpretation, and it's entirely possible that the Great Kivas served multiple functions at different times or for different groups. What's undeniable is the scale of the labor and the sophistication of the design. Building Casa Rinconada required excavating thousands of cubic feet of earth, quarrying and shaping hundreds of stone blocks, engineering a roof structure that could span 63 feet without internal supports beyond the 4 central pillars, and doing all of this with an accuracy that allowed for precise solar alignments. It's a feat that demands respect and wonder, and it reminds us that the people of Chaco were not fumbling in the dark. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it with a mastery that we can admire even if we can't fully understand the cultural context that made it necessary. There's one more detail worth mentioning, a small but tantalizing clue. Acoustic studies conducted in Casa Rinconada and other Great Kivas have shown that these spaces have remarkable sound properties. Voices resonate in specific ways, certain frequencies are amplified, and the overall effect is that a single person speaking or singing at the center of the kiva can be heard clearly throughout the entire space, even by someone standing at the back wall. Whether this acoustic effect was intentional or a happy accident is debatable, but it's hard to imagine that the Chacoans, who paid such meticulous attention to every other aspect of design, didn't notice and exploit it. Sound and ritual go hand in hand in nearly every culture. The right voice, the right chant, the right drumbeat at the right moment. These things can alter consciousness, induce trance states, create a sense of unity among participants. In the enclosed, resonant space of a great kiva, sound would have been a tool as powerful as light. Picture yourself in Casa Rinconada on a winter night, the kiva packed with people, the fire burning at the center, smoke curling up toward the roof opening. A voice begins to sing, a lone voice, rising and falling, filling the chamber with sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. The song is old, passed down through generations, and though you don't know all the words, you feel their weight, their power. Around you, others join in, and the sound swells until it's not a collection of individual voices but a single force, vibrating in your chest, in your bones. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you're not separate anymore. You're part of something vast and ancient, and utterly beyond your control. And you understand, in that moment, why someone would spend years building this place, why they would invest so much labor and faith in creating a chamber underground. Because some experiences can happen under the open sky. Some transformations require darkness, enclosure, the sense that you've descended into the earth and emerged, somehow, changed. We need to talk about water, because in the end, every mystery about Chaco Canyon circles back to the same brutal fact. This is a desert that receives less than 9 inches of rain a year, and yet for more than 2 centuries, it supported a population and a monumental building program that should have been impossible. How did they do it? The answer, as far as we can tell, involves a level of hydrological engineering that's only recently begun to be fully appreciated. The Ancestral Puebloans at Chaco built an extensive system of dams, canals, and water control features designed to capture and channel every drop of moisture that fell during the brief but intense summer monsoons. Rainwater that would otherwise have rushed through the canyon in flash floods, violent, destructive, and useless, was instead diverted into networks of canals that fed agricultural fields and possibly storage reservoirs. At the head of several side canyons, researchers have found masonry dams, some more than 10 feet high, built to slow and spread runoff across terraced fields. Along the canyon floor, there are stone-lined canals, some stretching for hundreds of yards, that carried water to gardens where maize, beans, and squash were grown. Earthen berms and check dams created a series of steps down the slope, slowing the water and preventing erosion while allowing sediment, and the nutrients it carried, to settle onto the fields. It's an elegant system, and it worked. For a while. Paleoenvironmental studies, Analyses of tree rings, pollen cores, and packrat middens tell us that the Chacoan fluorescence coincided with a period of relatively favorable climate. Between roughly 850 and 1130 C, rainfall was slightly above average, and the summer monsoons were more reliable. Not abundant, not lush, but just enough. The Chacoans squeezed every possible advantage out of that marginal climate, and their water management system allowed them to grow surplus crops, which in turn supported the population and labor force needed to build the great houses and maintain the regional system. But around 1130 C, the climate shifted. Tree ring data shows a prolonged drought, one of the most severe in the region's history, that lasted for more than 50 years. Rainfall dropped, the monsoons became erratic, and the carefully engineered water systems that had sustained Chaco began to fail. Fields dried up, crop yields plummeted, and the surplus that had fueled the entire system, the food that supported the laborers, the feasts that brought communities together, the offerings that reinforced the power of the elite, all of it began to evaporate. And here's where the story gets complicated, because societies don't collapse the moment resources become scarce. They adapt. They change. They make choices. And the choices the Chacoans made in the final decades of their occupation tell us something important about the nature of their society, and the limits of human ingenuity in the face of environmental catastrophe. Some researchers believe that as drought tightened its grip, the Chacoan elites doubled down on their religious response. If the rains were failing, it must be because the rituals weren't being performed correctly, or the offerings weren't sufficient, or the gods were angry. So build more. Perform bigger ceremonies. Import more turquoise, more timber, more exotic goods. Demonstrate your piety and power through ever greater displays of wealth and labor. This might explain the burst of construction activity in the decades just before abandonment, the sense that the society was building frantically even as the environmental foundation crumbled beneath it. But that strategy, if strategy it was, didn't work. The rains didn't return. The crops continued to fail. And eventually, the people left. Where they went is a matter of ongoing research, but the general consensus is that Chacoan populations dispersed to areas with more reliable water sources: the Rio Grande Valley to the east, the Little Colorado River to the west, the northern San Juan River region. In those new locations, they founded or joined communities that reflected Chacoan influence in architecture, pottery, and social organization, but they never rebuilt Chaco itself. The great houses fell silent, the roads grew over with brush, and the canyon returned to the ravens and the wind. Yet here's the haunting question: could they have survived if they'd made different choices? If the elites had diverted labor from monumental construction to building more extensive and efficient water systems, or if they'd invested in storage to buffer against bad years, or if they'd decentralized the system so that outlying communities weren't required to support the center, might Chaco have endured? Or was the collapse inevitable, baked into the fundamental unsustainability of trying to build an urban center in a place with so little water? We don't know. What we do know is that the environmental challenges facing Chaco weren't unique. Societies around the world and throughout history have faced droughts, climate shifts, resource depletion. Some adapt and survive. Others collapse. The difference often comes down to flexibility, to the ability of a society's institutions and leadership to recognize when the old ways aren't working and to embrace change before it's too late. Chaco, it seems, couldn't make that shift. Or maybe wouldn't. And so it ended, not with conquest or cataclysm but with a slow unraveling, families packing up their belongings and walking away, leaving the great houses to stand as monuments to ambition and to the hubris of believing that faith and engineering could overcome the limits of the desert. There's a legend, told by some contemporary Puebloan people, that the spirits of the Chacoan ancestors still walk the canyon, still perform their rituals, still watch over the ruins. Some say that if you're in the canyon at dawn or dusk, when the light is strange and the shadows stretch long, you might hear the echo of drums, the faint murmur of voices raised in song. Rangers and researchers have reported odd experiences. Tools moved from where they were left, footsteps crunching on gravel when no one else is around, a pervasive sense of presence in certain areas of the site. Scientifically, there's no evidence for any of this. But spiritually, emotionally, it resonates. Chaco was a place of immense power, immense effort, immense belief. And maybe, in some sense that we don't have the instruments to measure, that power lingers. Picture yourself in Chaco Canyon in the late afternoon, the sun low and golden, the sandstone walls glowing like fire. You're standing in one of the great houses, in a room that's open to the sky now, the roof long gone, the floor littered with stone and sand. A gust of wind moves through, carrying the scent of sage, and just for a second, you think you hear something, a whisper, a note of music, something that's there and gone so fast you can't be sure it was real. You stand very still, listening, but the moment has passed. The canyon is silent again. And you're left with that uncertainty, that sense that there's more to this place than brick and mortar, more to the story than what the archaeologists can excavate. Some mysteries, you realize, aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to remind us that the world is stranger, deeper, and more layered than we usually acknowledge. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's exactly how it should be. So where does all of this leave us? We've walked the roads, descended into the kivas, stood in the shadow of Pueblo Bonito, and examined the evidence from a dozen different angles. We've considered theories of pilgrimage and trade, of astronomy and social control, of environmental adaptation and religious fervor. We've acknowledged the darker threads, violence, coercion, possible cannibalism, alongside the undeniable achievements in engineering, architecture, and communal organization. We've listened to the legends of giants and curses, and we've wrestled with the question of how much weight to give oral traditions versus hard archaeological data. And after all of that, what's the answer? What was Chaco Canyon? The truth is, there isn't a single answer. Chaco was many things, to many people, at different times. It was a ceremonial center where communities gathered to renew social bonds and perform rituals that connected them to the cosmos. It was a trading hub where turquoise and copper and exotic pottery changed hands, where alliances were forged and status was negotiated. It was an astronomical observatory where priests or shamans tracked the movements of the sun and moon to determine the timing of agricultural and ceremonial activities. It was a display of power, a demonstration that the leaders of Chaco commanded resources and labor on a scale that dwarfed anything else in the region. It was a sacred landscape, every road and building and petroglyph part of a grand design meant to align human life with divine order. And it was, perhaps inevitably, a project that exceeded the carrying capacity of its environment, a civilization that reached too far and paid the price when the climate turned and the rains stopped falling. The reason Chaco fascinates us, the reason we keep returning to its mysteries, is that it holds up a mirror to our own ambitions and anxieties. We look at those massive structures, those impossibly straight roads, those precise astronomical alignments, and we see a society that believed it could master its environment, that through enough effort and faith and ingenuity, it could overcome the limitations of geography and climate. We see ourselves. Because we're doing the same thing, aren't we? We're building cities in deserts, pumping water from aquifers that won't refill in our lifetimes, engineering solutions to environmental problems even as we continue the behaviors that create those problems. We're convinced that our technology, our knowledge, our sheer determination will see us through, that we can keep growing, keep building, keep consuming without facing the kind of reckoning that overtook Chaco. And maybe we can. Our tools are more sophisticated, our understanding of ecology and climate is more refined, our capacity to mobilize resources is vastly greater. But the fundamental challenge is the same. How do you build a sustainable society in a world of finite resources? How do you balance short-term pressures, the need to feed your people, maintain your power, demonstrate your legitimacy, with long-term survival? How do you recognize when your system is failing and find the flexibility to change course before it's too late? These aren't ancient questions. They're the most urgent questions we face today. And Chaco Canyon, for all its mystery, offers a cautionary lesson. No matter how impressive your monuments, no matter how sophisticated your engineering, no matter how deep your faith or how precise your understanding of the cosmos, if you can't live within the limits of your environment, you will fall. That's not mythology. That's ecology. But there's another layer to what Chaco teaches us, one that's less about warnings and more about wonder. The people who built Chaco Canyon created something beautiful. They took stone and timber and human effort and shaped them into a landscape of meaning, a place where every road and building and carved spiral spoke to their deepest beliefs about how the universe worked and their place within it. They didn't have our technology, but they had something just as powerful, a shared vision, a collective sense of purpose, a cultural framework that made it meaningful to haul a log 70 miles or spend years carving a perfect spiral or gather in an underground chamber to sing together under the smoke and the firelight. We've lost a lot of that. Our societies are fragmented, our sense of shared purpose is frayed, our monuments tend to be corporate headquarters and shopping malls rather than sacred sites. But the human need for meaning, for connection, for creating something larger than ourselves, that hasn't changed. It's still there, still driving us, still shaping what we build and how we live. Chaco reminds us that this need is ancient, that it's woven into who we are as a species. And maybe, just maybe, if we can reconnect with that sense of shared purpose, if we can find a vision that's both materially sustainable and spiritually nourishing, we might avoid Chaco's fate. We might build something that lasts not just for centuries but for millennia, something that future generations will look at with the same mixture of awe and bafflement that we bring to Chaco Canyon today. The mysteries of Chaco, why the roads, what the alignments meant, how the society organized itself, why it fell, may never be fully solved. And in a sense, that's okay. Because the deepest mystery isn't about Chaco at all. It's about us. It's about what we choose to build, what we choose to value, what legacy we choose to leave. Chaco is a question posed in stone, and every generation has to answer it anew. So here's my invitation to you: keep asking questions. Keep digging, literally or figuratively, into the past. Visit Chaco Canyon if you can, or find the ancient sites near you and walk their trails, touch their walls, stand in their shadows. Read the research, support the archaeologists, and the indigenous communities who are working to preserve and interpret these places. And most importantly, think about what it all means, not just for understanding the past, but for navigating the present and building the future. The secrets of Chaco Canyon are still there, still waiting. Some lie in the ground, waiting for the next excavation, the next technological advance that might reveal what previous generations of researchers missed. Others lie in the oral traditions of the Puebloan people, stories passed down through centuries that might hold clues to questions we haven't yet learned to ask. And some, maybe, lie within ourselves, in our capacity for wonder, for curiosity, for recognizing that we're part of a story that's much bigger and older than our individual lives. Keep digging. Keep questioning. Keep listening. Because some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, waiting for the moment when you're ready to uncover them. And when you do, when you brush away the dust and see what's been hidden for 1,000 years, you might find that you're not just learning about the past. You're learning about the present, about the future, about what it means to be human in a universe that's beautiful and mysterious and utterly indifferent to our plans. Chaco Canyon stands there still, under the endless desert sky, its walls crumbling slowly back into the earth, its roads gradually vanishing beneath sand and scrub. But the questions it asks, about ambition and sustainability, about faith and failure, about what we build and why we build it, those questions echo louder with every passing year. And somewhere, in the silence between the wind and the ruins, the ancestors are still watching, still waiting to see if we've learned anything at all.